We started our trip from Cheyenne, Wyoming on April 23rd, destined to Sacramento, California for the Railfair. We had a great trip. Started out by lining our coal cars up and our oil cars up so that we had fuel for the locomotive. We lined up several fire departments between here and Sacramento. The SP furnished us many helpers along the way to give us water at various fire stations along the way. We had our own people lined up to give us water on the Union Pacific. We had a very successful trip as far as water, fuel, oil, and coal was concerned. We had 18 people with us on this trip that were some officers, some consultants, and some volunteers. Everyone seemed happy to be on the trip and seemed to enjoy the trip very much. It was a great trip as far as I'm concerned. The people were so cooperative and so helpful that we just can't say enough about what a great group of people they were. People wonder why the Union Pacific spent all the time, energy, and money to make this trip. Well, I think number one, Union Pacific being the number one railroad in the nation, wanted to be a part of Railfair. It's probably the greatest railfair that's ever been put on. I worked for the railroad for 45 years and I've never seen anything to equal it in my life. We had a beautiful presentation down there for the public, and as I understand, there were about 2 million people attended the railfair in the 10-day period it was there. Union Pacific always wants to be a part of railroading. They're people that are railroad oriented, they're a great railroad, and they couldn't see themselves sitting aside and not being part of a great show that was put on in Sacramento. I think the cost was very high, but I think Union Pacific is happy to pay that cost in order to participate in such a real trip. The volunteers were the people that rebuilt the 3985. They had a desire to do something with a group, and they asked the Union Pacific if they could rebuild that locomotive, and the Union Pacific very kindly assigned them space in the roundhouse, gave them the help of getting the locomotive from the show pad here west of the Cheyenne Depot into the roundhouse where they worked on it for 2 years. The end result was, instead of taking one locomotive to Railfair, which was the 8444, we wound up taking the 3985 also.
The Union Pacific Railroad is unusual in western railroads in the United States. In fact, it's unique in the United States in their having these 2 steam locomotives not only under steam and preserved, but also in operating like this. For the railroad to achieve a 2,300-mile trip with these 2 engines is certainly something to stir most anyone's interest and imagination. A little over a year and a half ago, some employees of the Union Pacific up at Cheyenne had the idea to perhaps restore the engine to steaming. The railroad was already operating occasionally an engine of the 484 wheel arrangement, number 8444. So they worked for over a year and a half, and to most people's amazement, excuse me, they were able to complete the work. Fortunately, the company gave them their blessing, and they did get the thing running, and it ran well. It is the largest operable steam locomotive in the world. I think there's no question on that claim. Weighs over 1 million pounds under steam, over 121 feet long, and could operate, if need be, 90 miles an hour, some say 100. The engine is the articulated type. It has 2 sets of drivers and 2 sets of cylinders, and as the term articulated implies, it can each set of drivers can go their own way on a curve. They're not all rigidly connected. It had the facility operating at high speeds with very little rail wear because of this articulation feature, and could operate long distances without stopping for more coal or water. The engine was one of a large number built during World War II, 1943 to be exact, and was operated extensively until the advent of the diesel. In the spring of 1959, the 3985 and most of the other engines were set aside, not needed. Dieselization had occurred much faster than expected, and no one ever expected to ever again see the engine operate under steam.
This is 3985. It was built in 1943 by Alco, retired in 1958. From 1958 to 1973, it sat in the Cheyenne Roundhouse. Ever since that time, was on display by the Cheyenne Depot. In 1978, a couple of Union Pacific employees got together and decided they'd like to restore the engine. So they went to the company with their proposal, and it was accepted. In 1979, in October 1979, it was moved from the depot to the roundhouse when the restoration work began. The main work was working on the boiler, doing things so I'd be able to meet FRA inspection standards. That means things like replacing tubes, checking stables, making sure they're all solid, make sure the firebox solid, the boiler's solid, no leaks in the boiler. Taking out superheater units, repairing them, sticking them back in, checking appliances out such as air pumps, injectors, power reverse gear. The heaviest job was taking all the superheater units out of the boiler, checking them all under water pressure and putting them all back in. There's 48 of them and they're all heavy. There are quite a few parts available in the roundhouse itself. We also have another steam engine, the 838, which we took some parts off of. Also the 4004, which is in Holiday Park here in Cheyenne, supplied some of the parts, mainly, for example, the injector. It's the only articulated locomotive left in the U.S. in operating condition.
This is a Challenger type steam locomotive built for the Union Pacific in 1943 and was used in freight and passenger service for the next 2 decades. This locomotive is known also by its wheel arrangement, which is 4664. To the best of our knowledge, it's the largest coal-burning steam locomotive operating in North America. The locomotive weighs in excess of 1 million pounds and uses coal, of which we carry 28 tons in the tender, plus 25,000 gallons of water. When the fire is lighted, it evaporates water, which is put in by means of this injector, and makes the steam, which shows on this gauge, and this in turn, when the throttle is opened and the reverse gear thrown forward, the brakes released, propels the engine down the track. If the engineer from his operating station here decides to reverse the locomotive, he stops by applying this brake, reversing the engine by pulling this mechanism back, and then opening the throttle again. We're now viewing the Challenger type locomotive, Union Pacific Challenger, from the fireman's operating seat. As you see in front of me, these are all of the controls which the fireman will have to know about and have expertise in operating in order to get this locomotive to function properly and to steam. To begin with, the 28 tons of coal, which is carried in the tender behind us, is transmitted to the firebox by an auger which comes under the deck, up, inside, and then blown into the various portions of the firebox by steam stoker jets. The speed of the stoker can be controlled with these 2 valves. In the event that the stoker would fail, with a locomotive and a firebox of this magnitude, it would be impossible to hand fire this locomotive much as we did the smaller locomotives in bygone days. We must have this locomotive operating on its stoker and all of the controls that you see here in order to make a successful trip with this locomotive pulling a large train. The draft for the locomotive, when it is not operating, can be controlled with this blower. This in turn affords the 3 principles which we must have in the firebox of a steam locomotive in order to make it function. We must have fuel, we must have oxygen, and we must have proper temperature. If we attain all of these, we should be able to boil the water which is inside of the boiler, evaporate it into steam, which is a usable energy and can be transmitted from the throttle to the cylinders in order to propel the locomotive. If all of these conditions are satisfied, the locomotive will operate efficiently and strong up and down the tracks for many days with a big train without any major problems except taking on more water and more fuel.
just couldn't get on them, and with light a match and throw in there and get a fire started, and we'd take off down the road. It took preparation. When you'd go to work at 3 o'clock in the morning on a cold morning, you didn't go down there and just get out and get on it and go without a lot of preparation. You had the fire lighter. He would put quite a layer of coal in there, and he would take a piece of oily waste, which is waste was some rags that had been shredded up and soaked in oil, and he'd take and throw this piece of oily waste into his firebox, and he would light it with a match, naturally, and then he would take another big long pipe, had oil, waste oil and air on it, and he'd blow that hot oil on that coal, and with the blower, it creates a draft through the firebox and up through the flues, and blowing this oil in there, creating quite an inferno. So you get out to go, the fire's already started, and you've got your boiler pressure up. And this Challenger carried 280 pounds per square inch. It'd take a long time to build up that much pressure. So you'd get out and get her liven up a little bit as a fireman, and when the engineer come out, and he'd check the engine over, and we'd get on and we'd go. Of course, there were days that when they weren't steaming right, just like a man nowadays, if he gets up in the morning and don't feel just good, there's not much that'll make him feel better. And that's the way with those steam engines. You might get out and start out on a run today, and if they didn't want to steam, they just wouldn't steam. No more what you could, whatever you might want to do to make them steam, or if they didn't want to steam, they wouldn't. And sometimes you could correct the problem, and adjusting the jets and the stoker, and fixing the divider, and blowing a little bit more coal in different corners and fill up the holes. Why, sometimes you could bring it out of it and make it really talk and do what you want to do with them. Naturally, with a firebox and a boiler as large as was on the Challenger, well, it needed a lot of coal and a lot of water to take care of the operation. And depending on the size of the tonnage of the train and the terrain of the road, it all depends on how far you can go in a tank full of water and a tender full of coal. Yeah, when you get low on coal and water, you'd pull up to the towns. We had them spaced along the way. It had the coal chutes and the water plug, we'd call it, with a big water stand, possibly a 10 or 12-inch standpipe. And the engineer would pull up and stop, make his spot, so to speak, and the fireman would get up and it would take the spout hook and reach around and pull the water spout around, and it was a long nozzle on there, and as you pulled it around, and it had weights on it, and you'd take the water spout and stick it in the water tank and pull a lever, and you'd have 10 or 12-inch flow of water going in that water tank. So that's the way you took the water. Then you'd have a big coal chute. They'd have regular coal chute attendants, and as you would take coal on some of the engines, you'd pull a great big chute down, and then you'd pull another lever, and it would open up a kind of a baffle type of a door in the bottom of the coal chute, and it would let coal, the weight of the coal would force it out, and it would fill up the tender of the engine. And with these big Challengers, you'd have to take and maybe make 3 or 4 so-called spots, that is, moving the engine maybe 6 or 7 feet, one way or the other, in order to fill up the tender. I really enjoyed handling the trains and handling the Challenger, and of course, like I say, I came up by way of the scoop shovel, and I was glad to get rid of the scoop shovel, because there was a lot of coal that went through that fire door, and the only way it went through the fire door was that fireman bending over that scoop shovel, putting it in the hole. All in all, when the Challenger came along, we had a wonderful engine to work with. It was quite a challenge, quite a romance in the firing and running of these locomotives. I was really sorry to see them go when they get away with them. I like the steam.
My name's John Hugh Coker, and I suppose I am a rail fan. My dad bought me a Lionel train set when I was 4 years old, and I guess that was the end of my normal life. Since then, I've always been interested in trains, on and off, but mostly on.
All over the United States are many thousands of people known as rail fans. They are mostly interested in taking photographs of railroads. In the days of steam power, they took steam power pictures, of course. Now, in the age of the diesel, they enthusiastically carry that interest forward to the present. The outpouring of thousands of people who are just simply enthralled by seeing this, and who went long distances, many of them halfway across the continent, indicates the railroad has certainly attracted the imagination and interest of people everywhere.
I came all the way out here from Richmond, Virginia, just to chase that steam engine over to Ogden, Utah, to get a shot of it on movie film.
And I came up here to Colorado, Wyoming area and chased the Challenger with a rather large fellowship of other rail fans.
And of course, these people especially were interested in this achievement of putting this Challenger locomotive back into operation.
We're sure happy to see the 3985 restored. We hope that it'll pull many a fan trip, and it's quite a sight to see 2 big steam locomotives like this double heading.
I personally feel that the locomotives are the most interesting part of railroading. I like the atmosphere.
The crowd was composed largely of what are known as railfans, but along with it, I suspect, were just as many ordinary citizens who just seeing something very unusual to see again, or maybe for the first time, in the case of many of the younger people, a locomotive operating under steam power.
It was the first time I have seen a steam engine.
Well, it was kind of neat. I thought it was really interesting. I like when the smoke came out of the top of it. I'd like to drive it. The only thing I didn't like about it is when it blew its whistle. I like when the whistle blew when me and my partner, when she jumped at me.
For hundreds of thousands of people followed the locomotives along the highways and railroads all the way from here to Sacramento, California. Even to the return to Cheyenne, where there was a huge group met the locomotives when they came back in, and they were very enthusiastic as we arrived back in town.
To understand the history of the railroads is to understand the history of this country. And the railroads were a major force in the building of the country and in the settlement of the West.
Yeah, the 3985 is a piece of history, you know, and the Union Pacific's donated all the parts and money, and all the people in Cheyenne's donated their labor and time. I mean, they believe in the old engines, that's all.
It's a great public relations achievement for the railroad industry, and the Union Pacific deserves a great deal of credit for this.
It was just a great, great trip.
One thing a person my age never had the opportunity to see was mainline steam, fast trains, polished locomotives, and a lot of pride. It was a dream come true for many rail fans.